Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Well, Heidi, we've got a really interesting show today because we're going to be talking about navigating health and wellness after loss, and we've got some great guests. But before we get started, I want to remind everyone that our new book, my new book with my fiance, Dr. Frank Powers, is now out, Open to Love, The Secrets of Senior Dating. We know from the Surgeon General that loneliness is one of the biggest aspects of what's going on in America today. And Frank and I were very interested because we met online after my husband passed away, Heidi's dad. And we have written a book together, how we navigated it, and we've both been therapists for 40 years apiece, a total of 80 years. So we use our wisdom in the book. I guess wisdom. Some of the things I found out from being a widow, though, I was surprised about. So we use our own story and also the stories of our clients and advice. So you might want to get it. It's on Amazon. And we want to tell you that 100% of the proceeds for this book are going to the Open to Hope Foundation with the mission of helping people find hope after loss.
Okay, awesome, Mom.
So let's get started with the show today. Again, we're going to talk about navigating health and wellness after loss. Do you want to introduce our guests?
Yes, we'll be speaking with Jeanne Jacobwitz and Meghan Riordan-Jarvis. Hello, Jeanne and Meghan.
Hi.
Hi, it's so great to have you on the show today. We're excited to have you here.
And such an important topic.
Absolutely, and you guys are really experts on it, so it's going to be awesome.
So let me start with Jeanne. Jeanne has a master's degree in science and public health from Columbia University. She is a board member at the W Connection, which is a nonprofit organization that helps widows rebuild their lives after losing a spouse. And we've had a couple of people from the W Connection on
great organization.
Past shows. Yeah, it really is. Jeanne teaches at Georgetown University, and up until today, she was also teaching at New York University. She's retired there in the Graduate Midwifery Women's Health Program. Jeanne received the Excellence in Teaching Award from the American College of Nurse Midwives. Welcome to our show, Jeanne.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And Jeanne, I want to say, has done some great research using widows on loss, and we're going to be talking about that today, Sue. So it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think we're going to start with Jeanne, and then we'll introduce Meghan.
Yeah, okay, why don't we do that? We'll start with you, Jeanne, because you guys have got such great resumes. We want to make sure that we get some focus on that. Tell us how you got into this field and some of your background.
So I practiced as a clinical midwife, hospital-based midwife for a number of years. And then after my husband David passed away, I decided to figure out what was the next, what was going to happen next. He passed away.
And how many years ago was that?
2010.
Okay.
And coincidentally, at the same time that I decided to leave clinical practice, Georgetown University opened their online graduate advanced practice nursing program. So for family nurse practitioners, women's health nurse practitioners, and nurse midwives. So I started teaching in their program. And at the same time that I found that in 2013, I also found the W Connection.
Which is for widows?
Yes, it's a nonprofit that has become virtual and national following COVID. And we're not a bereavement organization, but we provide peer-led support groups. We have trained facilitators. I run the webinars, so bring in experts, just as you would be, for our members. And now we open some of our programs to non-members as well, with the goal of helping people who've lost a spouse or partner move forward.
As I have. I lost my husband 3 years ago, Heidi's dad, so I'm going to be interested,
so you know
particularly in some of your research.
Yes.
So let's move on and introduce our next guest, and then we want to get into some of that.
Okay, Meghan Riordan-Jarvis has a master's degree and is also a licensed clinical social worker. She is an author, podcast host. She has the podcast Grief is My Side Hustle. She is a 2-time TEDx speaker, and she has created the Grief Mentor Method to help everyone create a structured, personalized grief process.
And we have her book here.
Meghan has written 2 books. This is a memoir called End of the Hour. And she has also written one which is going to be published in October of 2024 called Can Anyone Tell Me Why? Essential Questions About Grief and Loss.
Fantastic. Yes. All right.
Welcome to our show, Meghan.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So, Jeanne, talk a little bit about your research. What have you found about widows? Now, I wanted to say I was very surprised that people are widowed an average at 59 women. Is that correct?
Yes, and it's getting younger.
It's getting younger because
yes.
I had to. I noticed I went online and it said 56 in one area, and then it said 59 in another area. What's accounting for widows being widowed earlier?
That's a complicated question because to just generalize about widows, if you want to break it down by race, by ethnicity, by culture, there are different reasons why people become widowed. Mm-hmm. It could be accidents, it could be suicide, it could be murder, it could be violence, it could be drug abuse. It's so many different reasons why someone is widowed. And because of that, it can happen at a much younger age.
Yeah. We'll talk about what happens in health and wellness for women and why you did your research and why you're concerned.
Yeah. So when I joined the W Connection, and I still remember it was one evening, one of our members has a outdoor restaurant on the Upper West Side in New York City. And so a lot of our New York-based people were there. And when they found out I was in women's health, I was a magnet for them to talk to me about how their health had changed since they had lost their spouse or partner. They just didn't feel good, or they were diagnosed with something they had never had before. And then I found out that there was one group, a support group of ours on the Upper West Side, women aged 40 to 65. Some were a year out, some were 4 or 5 years out, and they all were diagnosed with breast cancer.
Wow.
No risk factors in their families.
That's interesting.
And I went to our executive director, Dawn Nargi, and I said, Dawn, there's something here. This is just not random. And the public health part of me said, this is like the beginning of a cluster. So what do they have in common? And this was in 2018 when we started talking about it. And I approached Georgetown and two colleagues of mine, and we decided to survey widows through social media. We went on all different sites for this anonymous survey. And what was interesting in the first study was the most powerful question was, if your healthcare provider recommended you come in more frequently, would you? And it was a resounding yes.
Wow.
And
but we know they aren't, and so now your second study is going to be looking at healthcare providers and seeing what they say. Well, I wanted to ask you, Meghan, you're a little different. You lost both your parents. Talk about your story, because you had a health crisis too. So one of the things we want to highlight here is that grief and loss is a risk for health issues. And we want to get into the spouse loss, and now you had a parent loss. Talk a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so I'm a psychotherapist, and I specialize in grief and loss. So that has been sort of, my world for a really long time. But when you dig in with psychotherapy, nobody really walks into the world of grief and loss for no reason. When I was in my early 20s, I started therapy ostensibly because I went through a hard breakup. And what I noticed was I had watched other friends in their 20s go through a breakup and just seemed to bounce back and recover and start dating at a much more rapid speed than I seemed to be able to. And I had a moment there where I thought, I'm going to wear out the welcome of these new friends that I've just made in DC, where I had moved to, if I don't figure out how to get a hold of these feelings. And so that was the first time I stepped into therapy. At the end of that first therapy session, which was really me just sort of crying about a love loss, the therapist asked me a question that nobody ever asked me before, which was, did anything difficult ever happen in your childhood? And my answer was no. And then I went home to my row house in DC, and I thought, well, actually, when I was 9, a teenager that was beloved to my family drowned while we were all at the beach, but nobody knew until later. But I wonder if that counts. When I brought that back to the therapist, what unfolded really rapidly was the legacy of unspoken trauma in childhood. And I pretty smugly fell deeply in love with therapy, much more than I had ever been in love with the man in the relationship I was in. Fell deeply in love with therapy, trained in all the trauma modalities, all the treatments that help you move the energy of loss through your body. And, did what you do, aged, met my husband, had kids. And I thought, this is great. I have figured this out. I understand grief and loss. I help people with grief and loss. And then in 2016, my dad was diagnosed with small cell cancer. And, you know, that's where the rubber meets the road. We had a year, small cell cancer is essentially a death sentence. And so we had a year of sort of a longish goodbye. And that experience, which I write about in End of the Hour, is what I think we talk about when we say sort of typical grief experience where the grief kind of resolves, the trauma of it resolves on its own using the supports that you have in front of you. Your life path that you were on, you stay on, it just has a big bump in the road. But in 2019, my mom died suddenly while I was on vacation with her.
Wow. And this was a couple of years after your death?
Yeah, 2 years after my dad. And that was just the absolute opposite experience. Pretty much instantly from the moment I discovered she had died, she had had a short illness, although it wasn't something that anyone thought she was going to die from. I immediately had what we call in therapy a rumination, you know, a thought that walks in a circle and doesn't really give you any information, that it was my fault that she died. And what I knew, it was almost like I stepped outside of my body. There was a clinician part of me that was like, oh no, I know what this is because I treat
And
this.
I'm an expert on grief.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
I know what this is. And so my experience with that was I watched myself rapidly become ill the way my clients had described getting ill. I stopped sleeping. I wasn't able to eat. I was really, we use this phrase window of tolerance, which just basically means what you can put up with and what feels good, and nothing felt good and I couldn't put up with anything. Lights were too bright, noises were too loud. And my thinking got really, really scary. I wasn't going to harm myself, but if a bus happened to jump the curb and hit me, I was going to be fine with that. So because of my work life, I had the incredible privilege of, one, understanding that I was getting sick and that I was not likely to be able, I needed treatment. It wasn't going to resolve on its own like with my dad. I was going to need interventions that were going to need to be performed with me, things like EMDR and sensory motor psychotherapy types of interventions. And I knew the name and the phone number of a clinic to call.
Yeah, you know, I have to say, when you say this, it makes me think about when my husband died 3 years ago. Cara in Palo Alto, I knew the organization well because I was connected with them. I called the director because I knew him personally. I said, because I said to myself, I'm going to do what I tell other people to do, even though I don't really think they're going to be able to help me. So I called him and said, you know, Jim Tucci, I said, you're not going to be able to help me. And he said, why? Because I said, you know, my son died 40 years ago. I've been in the grief and loss world all this time. We've been doing a podcast for 20 years, you know, and now my husband dies, and, who's going to be able to help me? And so next I get a call from a guy named Jim, and he says, yeah, my son died and my wife died, and I train all the volunteers at Cara.
So that was who they paired you with.
Like,
yeah, that was a great pair.
Kumbaya.
Look at that.
You know, it was a lucky.
It's almost like you're observing yourself.
Yeah.
You both were kind of saying, okay, this is my client, but it was you.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, I was pretty mad, right? Like I had done all this work, I'd done all these hours of training. I really felt like, I have insulated myself.
I'm the expert professional. I'm not the other.
I will, if anyone, and part of the reason I write about it in the book, about how ill I get and what the illness looks like, is one, I really want to help people distinguish between grief that we think of as, you know, just needing support, and grief that actually becomes an illness. And I don't really think our current diagnosis of prolonged grief disorder is very helpful. If I had waited a year to get treatment, I mean, I would have been so much more ill. So I write about it in the book, but also I wanted people to understand that here I am. I have 2 master's degrees. I have 20 years in the field working with people with very profound grief and loss and helping them, and all these clinical hours and trainings, and that did not inoculate me from my own experience.
It's a real surprise. Jeanne, do you relate to this after your husband died? Because you were in the field and nursing.
Oh, absolutely. It's so different. All the years that I was on one side of the consultation desk, And now I was on the other, and I think we were talking, and I was saying how I went to a bereavement group that was by United Way, and it was different losses people had suffered. And I just couldn't find my space because I had run groups. I did a perinatal bereavement program, and then here I am, one of the participants. And it's very hard because also there are expectations that you can self-diagnose, which is really not true.
That's right.
Right?
That's totally right.
But what's very interesting that you brought up about feeling sick, and we've chatted a bit that I really believe widowhood specifically, because that's sort of my area, but in general with loss is a risk factor for disease.
Absolutely.
There's a study that came out of Norway, which is fascinating, where they looked at women that were 50, who were widowed at 50 and over, and they followed bone densities, and they saw the rate of bone loss and osteoporosis was much, much higher than in the same population that was married or had not suffered a loss. There are studies now that are looking that actually they're seeing a dysregulation at the cellular level in the DNA because of grief and loss.
Well, now I wanted to, when she brought up her mother dying 2 years after her dad, what did your mom die of?
So we don't know, and I don't know if this is where you're headed, but there are statistics that talk about people who are in long-term marriges dying within 2 years of their spouse.
Yeah, we were talking about that, right?
Takotsubo syndrome. It's called the widowhood effect or broken heart syndrome. And it can be as early as 3 months. So one of the reasons of this, looking now at primary care providers for me with the second study, is simply because nobody is asking if someone's a widow. It's married, single, divorced. They're not asking about loss in general.
That's a good
or if
point.
they do, I'm so sorry for your loss, I'm sure you'll get better.
Right.
What we know now also is that person who says, I say to you, so how are you doing now? And you say, I'm fine.
Yeah, of course, I'm
except
fine.
your
and
brain
your kids
is
don't
not.
know you're not fine either
Well,
because you, people tell me, oh, I'm happy things are going well, and I'm like, their kids say my mom's doing really well or my dad's doing really well, or somebody, well, you're not going to go to Thanksgiving dinner with them or Christmas or a birthday party, or they invite you somewhere on Friday night, and you're not going to sit and cry the whole time. You're going to act like,
But we also
fine.
believe it sometimes, and the brain doesn't stop.
That's right.
Your stress hormones are just bombarding you constantly.
Right.
But there are things that we know by stimulating the happy hormone oxytocin that can help at a basic level to counteract some of that exhaustion of your immune system.
And that's through hugging, and I think that's why women love to get dogs, or men who have had a loss, because it's something warm. And, we used to say back in the nursing world, 40 years ago, we said the technology was just coming up, and our words were high tech, high touch. And we have forgotten that. High tech, high touch. People need hugs. They need to shake hands.
That's what I was going to ask. What are things that you would both recommend?
Yes.
When people, like you said, your system is so deregulated. I mean, I remember when my brother died, and my father, but especially my brother because he was only 17, I'd be sleeping, and the minute I'd wake up, I'd be flooded with stress. I'd be like, my brother's dead. For 1 second, I'd be okay, and the next second, it would dawn on me that he's dead. For a few years, I was always very keyed up. So what can we do when we're so dysregulated?
I think there's two things. One is we are so poorly educated about the physicality of grief and loss.
Yes.
So my big soapbox is explaining to folks, there is like this ethos out there that we can't really teach grief and loss because it's so personal. But if you look at it from the perspective of the body, because we all live in human bodies and we grieve with our body, there's plenty that we can teach people. We can remind the people who haven't heard the biology about, we have 12 systems in our body that interact with each other. And so when your digestive tract is shutting down, to know that like it's not just your digestive tract that's going to be impacted by that. It's also your endocrine system. You know, the number of grievers that have sat in front of me and said, I don't know what's going on. My hair is falling out or my skin is really brittle. And saying, do you know that your skin and your nails and your hair are all one system, and that system would also be impacted by your grief and loss?
I have to tell you, when my husband was ill a lot of times, he'd had a lot of surgeries. The last time before this time that he died, he'd had surgery, and my hair fell out.
Yeah.
And you know what? I was terrified.
Of course.
After he died, that my hair was going to. It took 2 years for it to grow back in, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm combing my hair and looking at every hair follicle.
But I think it's appalling that we don't educate people. I mean, I was just giving a talk today, and it was to clinicians, and I asked people to raise their hand. There were about 200 people in the room, just to give me a sense of who had taken a training in grief and loss. And only 3 people raised their hand. 3 people.
Yeah.
But every clinician is going to be sitting with a griever.
Because it's always an option. Grief and loss is never a required.
They're elective classes.
Always.
That's so odd. That's so odd.
I agree.
And so, you know, I think about my children. I have 3 teenagers.
Yeah.
And when they were all about 10 or 11, they were required in their public school to take a class on puberty. And they were required to take that class on puberty before they went through puberty, because we know puberty boggles the mind.
Yeah.
Right.
And so the hormones impact their ability to sort of take in information and to have a reflection about their body. So telling them these things are going to happen, don't freak out, is really important. As a trauma therapist, I have people that come into my office who they suffered with their symptoms out loud for about a year. They talked to people about how they weren't sleeping and they weren't eating, and that they had intrusive thinking, and that they a little bit didn't want to be alive. They talked about it out loud for about a year, for about 6 months, and then they stopped. They stopped talking about it, but they still felt it. And so when they came into my office and I said, oh no, brain fog is a real thing, and let me explain what's happening to your brain and why it's happening. Memory loss, absolutely standard in grief and loss. Not being able to follow multi-stepped instructions, that's run of the mill. I have people cry when I tell them that. And the population that it's really important to talk to about brain fog and memory loss is the elderly.
Yeah, because we have it anyway.
Their children are, they're grieving, and they can't remember whether their partner died.
And you feel, it unsettles you because you feel like people might think you're getting Alzheimer's. And of course you think maybe you
But
are.
I've had clients who have been taken to the doctor and had memory care conversations without any reflection by anyone that maybe this symptom is actually grief-related and has nothing to do with
So, Jeanne, what are some of your
cognition.
thoughts on what people can do if they've had a loss?
Well, I think what's important from my perspective now is exactly what you're talking about, educating the primary care providers.
Right.
So that's why in this study we're doing, we're listing a laundry list of symptoms to see what do they know. Do they even think that hair loss is related? And then, we're looking at knowledge, we're looking at attitudes and practices. And then there'll be, as I mentioned, a prompt with resources, because ultimately it's the social connection that people need.
That's right.
To be able to have someone not just, feel as if they don't know what to say to you, they're uncomfortable, but to be around people who get it and understand loss.
Support is huge.
And we've had members say, and I personally have felt this, when I meet someone and they've had a loss, there's a connection. Because you've gone in through the dark side.
They're from your hometown.
I had lost my brother, and then a year later my husband, then 6 months later my mother.
Wow.
And so you start to realize that loss is loss, right? It may come at different times and with different people in your life, but that feeling of feeling sick after, the brain fog, the hair loss, or just hypertension and diabetes, all of these things can come up, which is why we want people to say, you've suffered a terrible loss. And, again, my wheelhouse is widowhood. I'd like you back in 3 months. I want to check your blood pressure. I want to see your social support. I just want to see how if you're sleeping.
Man, when you say that, I want to see your social support. Have you ever heard a doctor say that, or a physician's assistant?
We need the conversation.
Say,
it's like everybody's having the conversation, except the primary care providers. They're being left out of the loop.
Well, and sometimes the therapists, and I am a therapist, are focusing on the emotional, psychological, and forgetting about the physical. Or just not bringing it up or not talking about it.
Well, they're so
enough.
interconnected.
Yes, they are.
Even
completely.
for therapists, there's so little training on grief and loss.
Yeah.
There's so little understanding that I think it feels overwhelming for everyone. There isn't like a protocol. It's not like OCD where, we do an assessment and then we know how to provide interventions based on our assessment. And we mentioned in my bio that my team has created this thing which is called the Grief Mentor Method. And it's exactly what we're talking about here, which is just a scope of interventions. They're not treatments because we're not trying to look at grief and loss as a mental health problem. It's instead a series of things that you can essentially create your own grief practice. You're going to have to grieve. And so what are the things that we can do? So when someone is really deep in physical symptoms, we give them physical interventions, things that do bilateral stimulation to sort of balance out the brain. And when people are really in thoughts, around their spirituality, why did this happen? Why did God let this happen?
You know what?
We give them interventions.
You are on and on with this, and I know it's in the book and these interventions. Where can people find you on the internet?
So I'm Meghan Riordan-Jarvis. You can find me on Instagram. That's where I'm the most active. Or just come to my website, and there's lots of ways to get on email lists to find out about the book and find out about the Grief Mentor Method.
I love it. And the book, again, is called The End of the Hour, and you can hear all about these wonderful interventions and everything she's doing. Now, are you a therapist? Do you do online therapy? Or?
I do. So right now I'm not working with very many clients. I have a few clients. Mostly what I'm doing is taking these interventions and these ideas into corporations and doing sort of keynotes, sort of the larger platform so that we can get people more educated about grief and loss.
Awesome. And Jeanne, where can people find you and your information?
So through the W Connection, and we have a website and on Instagram as well.
Okay. And do you have your research somewhere where people can read what you're doing and what you've done?
Not yet. Not yet. We're applying to the IRB, the Institutional Review Board at Georgetown. We're in that process now. We've completed the template for the survey, and then we'll test it out. And
how fabulous. I'm really wonderful to get this research on it. You guys are so amazing, and we want to thank all of you for joining us on this show today. And Heidi and I always want to remind you that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own, and God bless.